You are listening to KCSC's Voces Criticas Critical Voices. I am your host, Silvana Falcón. Today I'm here with Professor Chris Zepeda Millan, Assistant Professor of Comparative Ethnic Studies at UC Berkeley. Born and raised in the East Los Angeles barrio of Boyle Heights, Chris Zepeda Millan became the first Chicano to receive a PhD from the Department of Government at Cornell University in 2011. His research focuses on issues related to social movements, immigration, public opinion, racial politics, and interdisciplinary research methods, and has been published in several peer-reviewed journals. I've invited Chris to the show to talk about his brand new book called Latino Mass Mobilization, Immigration, Racialization, and Activism, published just a few weeks ago by Cambridge University Press. Welcome, Chris, to KCSC's Voces Criticas.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Your book talking about the massive 2006 immigrant rights mobilizations. First, can you remind us how large these mobilizations were in the country and where these collective actions occurred?
I think these were probably the largest demonstrations or series of mass demonstrations that most of us have ever witnessed. Between about February to May of 2006, upwards to 5 million people, most of who were Latino, took part in close to 400 demonstrations in almost every state in the country, from traditional immigrant gateway cities like San Francisco, Chicago, and New York, to smaller and rural cities and towns like Siler City, North Carolina, and Fort Myers, Florida, hosted a demonstration. So not only their size, but their geographic scope was pretty wide and far-reaching.
Can you provide us with a bit of context as to what were the social political factors at play that enabled these massive mobilizations to occur? Because these social movements, as we know, don't come out of nowhere.
I think it's important to remember that there's always been anti-Mexican sentiment in this country, even before half of Mexico was annexed by the United States in 1848. And Americans have always found different reasons to justify discriminating against us, from labor competition to stereotyping us as being dirty and violent, to Mexicans being a mongrel race composed of Indians, Spanish, and African blood. But from the late 1960s, when immigration laws were actually changed to, for the first time, put a ridiculously low limit on Mexican immigration that didn't reflect the actual needs of the American economy and how many Mexican workers it was actually using at the time, to about the mid to late 1990s, there was definitely an uptick in anti-Mexican sentiments, which also spilled over to Central Americans as well. But this time it came under the guise of immigration status. So it went from us being dirty Mexicans, spicks, greasers, and wetbacks, to the relatively new derogatory term they began to use and still use to justify discriminating against Mexicans and other Latinos, and that term being quote-unquote illegal immigrants. But leading up to the 2000 presidential elections, when pro-immigration Republican former Texas Governor George W. Bush won the White House, many people on both the left and the right thought immigration reform was finally going to get passed with some type of major legalization component for undocumented immigrants in it, because now we were going to have a pro-immigration reform Democratic Party in Congress and a pro-immigration reform Republican president in power. Unfortunately, the horrible and tragic events that occurred on September 11th, 2001 not only dashed these hopes, but they also marked the start of an even further increase in nativism that at first targeted Arabs and Muslims, but quickly began to include and eventually focus on Latino immigrants. We saw the immediate creation of the Department of Homeland Security and an upswing in immigration raids and deportations, the majority of which were targeting Latinos. And in the early 2000s, we also saw anti-immigrant activists begin to take advantage of this political moment and begin to organize these racist border vigilante groups like the Minutemen Project, which captured the national media's attention. Nonetheless, this tide of anti-Latino nativism culminated in December of 2005 when Congressman James Sensenbrenner and the Republican-led House of Representatives passed probably one of the most draconian anti-immigrant bills in U.S. history, H.R. 4437, which was officially named the Border Protection, Anti-Terrorism, and Illegal Immigration Control Act. Among its horrible provisions, like creating packs of dogs to go hunt crossing migrants in the desert, the bill sought to increase the penalty of being undocumented from what's currently merely a civil violation, like jaywalking or a parking ticket, into a serious federal felony. On top of this, the bill proposed to criminalize anyone who assisted undocumented people, even in the most basic ways, by fining them thousands of dollars and even potentially putting them in jail for helping undocumented people. So these were some of the background factors that led to the historic response from Latinos and immigrants across the country that we witnessed in the spring of 2006.
Yeah, your book talks a great deal about the significance of H.R. 4337, and I actually had forgotten some of the draconian details of that piece of legislation until I read your book. Can you tell us what other immigrant communities were part of the 2006 demonstrations besides Latinos?
It felt like almost every immigrant group was present at these demonstrations. So we saw different Asian, African, European, and Latin American immigrants participate in marches, both people who were going to be directly affected if the bill became a law and people who just wanted to show solidarity.
And so one of the tropes that exist about Latinos and political engagement is that as a community, we are not as politically engaged. And I believe your work challenges some of this trope. Can you talk a little bit about the forms and maybe temporality of this Latino political mobilization?
For years, there's been this trope of a Latino political sleeping giant that everyone's waiting to wake up, given that we're the largest minority group in the country. But the truth of the matter is, though, that we're a relatively young population. So about a third of us are under the age of 18, which means we're too young to vote. About another third of us are not citizens. So that leaves only about a third of the entire Latino population in the U.S. that's even eligible to vote, right? And this just means eligible, not actually registered to vote and not actually that go out and do it once they're registered. So, and unfortunately, we know that poor and working class people, for a host of different reasons in general, vote less. So the fact that many Latinos who are eligible to vote fall into this lower socioeconomic category means that we tend to have lower levels of political participation. Right. So that said, for about over 2 decades now, research has shown that Latinos tend to go out and vote at higher rates in response to anti-immigrant policies. Right. So if there's an anti-immigrant ballot measure, we're more likely to come out. 2006, I believe, showed us that voting isn't the only form of political expression that Latinos are willing to take part in, especially in response to anti-immigrant laws. We're also willing to take to the streets and protest. Throughout U.S. history, right, there's a whole bunch of different examples of Latinos across the country participating in activism. But what was interesting about 2006 is that at least survey research had shown us that Latinos are actually amongst the least likely to participate in both electoral and non-electoral forms of politics. And yet from 2006 to 2008, we saw this massive increase in Latino political participation in both mainstream and contentious forms of politics.
In your introduction chapter, you write, all in all, the 2006 immigrant rights demonstrations remind us that protest waves are neither linear or static. They are dynamic affairs. Can you explain what we miss when we think about demonstrations and protest in general in a linear manner?
So I think what I meant by that was that there's no one-to-one correlation between oppression and protest. In fact, if there's a common pattern, it's the opposite. That oppression rarely leads to overt forms of public protest. The conditions have to be right. And even when mass mobilizations do arise, there's so many moving parts and factors that could influence the variety of trajectories they take, the numerous impacts they do or don't have, right, which makes them pretty unpredictable. Right, which is why this historic series of demonstrations was so surprising, not only to racial politics, but also social movement scholars as well. I think a lot of times people think like, well, of course, there was this horrible law, so of course Latinos were going to protest, right? But the puzzle is actually the opposite. There's a lot of horrible laws all the time. I mean, we're seeing it right now with Trump, different things he's doing, and yet we don't see people on the streets. As I talk about in the book, I go into detail of why H.R. 4437 posed such a unique threat and the different moving parts and then historical kind of foundations that led to this opportunity and to it ended up materializing as probably the largest mass mobilizations in American history.
I think what's useful, too, about that framing is we often think of protest mobilizations in progress types of narratives as always sort of forward, making, inroads. And I think what your book offers us is that this is a very circular, nonlinear, very back and forth process. And I think we do a disservice to the history of protests if we think about them only in forms of progress, that is the only way to evaluate them. But I think your book is really detailing for us why we need to think about protest mobilizations in a kind of a holistic manner.
And I think oftentimes it's until someone could point to usually a major legislative change that people tend to identify a movement as being relevant or successful. And interestingly, again, we're talking about the largest series of demonstrations in most of our lifetimes, and yet there's no documentaries about it. The media never talks about it, right? Because they can't point to something. They're like, well, they're irrelevant. Right, they're irrelevant or they didn't matter because we can't point to, legalization didn't happen, right? And I think that the story I try to tell is a little bit more complex, as you just mentioned. It shows, look, it's always a give and take. Sometimes it's a step forward, 2 steps back, and then, you got to keep trying.
You were listening to Chris Zepeda Millan, Assistant Professor of Comparative Ethnic Studies at UC Berkeley. He is the author of a brand new book called Latino Mass Mobilization, Immigration, Racialization, and Activism, published by Cambridge University Press. The third chapter of your book is titled Promoting Protests Through Ethnic Media. So tell us what you mean by ethnic media.
I think what's commonly referred to as ethnic media is usually immigrant media, usually non-English language media. In the particular chapter that you're referring to, I write specifically about Spanish language news and entertainment outlets, which have a long history of being involved in social justice issues. Maybe not as often as activists would like, but nonetheless from denouncing the lynchings of Mexicans throughout the Southwest in the 1800s and 1900s to participating in pro-immigrant voter registration campaigns. Spanish language media has often participated in and on some occasions even led political protests in defense of Latino rights throughout American history.
Though often much is made about new forms of media like social media, what I found particularly enriching about your research is the role of the traditional media, like broadcast radio, like us here at KCSC, like TV. And I wondered if we're too quick to dismiss these traditional media tools, like broadcast radio, as an effective method of political organizing, especially in certain communities.
Since the 1990s, academics have been making a big deal about social media and the role of the internet. When I started graduate school, that was the big thing in social movement research. Like the internet was going to be the new major tool for activists, partly because it's controlled by activists themselves, right? Activists get to create their own frames, get to publish what they want to, they say what they want to say in it. But I think what 2006 showed us is the importance of a democratic media, whether that's online or with radio, TV, and even newspapers. 2006 showed us what the power of traditional media, of its political power when it's put in the hands of social justice activists. Ultimately, as important as online and social media have been, it's usually connecting like-minded people. You're not influenced people who are on, in the middle or on the margins, right? It's people who pay attention to social media and usually focus on a specific type. And I think what 2006 showed us is that, when these radio DJs, who for the most part are a form of entertainment media, and people listen to them for entertainment and come to trust them and see them as not like a political source, when they became politicized, when mainstream Spanish language news networks like Univision and Telemundo and Teleazteca, who traditionally have been sympathetic, at least on immigration issues, but when they actually use their power and their range and their influence to promote political protests, we see that literally could put millions of people on the streets. Ultimately, I think we have to remember that these are all corporations, right, whose primary interest is to increase their profits. What's interesting about immigration, though, is that it's one of arguably the only political issue in which corporate interests kind of end up aligning with community interests with regards to immigrant rights. Ethnic media outlets would not exist without the immigrant populations. In fact, they depend on the growth of immigrant populations for them to grow, to increase their reach as well. So you have this interesting situation where ethnic media, or the interests of ethnic media, kind of coincided with the interests of the immigrant rights movement, and we saw it ended up being like this perfect storm, right, that allowed activists to literally take to the airwaves for hours at a time every day to frame the issue and to promote the marches.
I think that's a great point around corporate media, because here at KCSC, we're a non-commercial public education radio station. And when that is your mandate, you are in service of the public. And so therefore, support your independent public radio stations, especially on your college campuses, because we are here to serve our community. You write about the involvement of undocumented people in get out the vote drives during the Obama campaign, specifically in 2008. I wondered if it surprised you that undocumented communities were willing to take this risk for President Obama's candidacy.
First off, let me start off by saying that The bravery and resilience of people without papers never ceases to amaze me. Their willingness to literally put their existence in this country on the line every day for their families and their dignity is something that I think 100 years from now, historians will be praising and reframing, probably problematically, as part of some American dream and immigrant bootstrap narrative. That said, I wasn't that surprised because I had seen it firsthand. As an undergraduate student, I interned with the Coalition for Humane Immigrant Rights of Los Angeles, CHIDLA, where I helped them out with their first ever Mobilize the Immigrant Vote campaign. So almost on a daily basis, I would see undocumented people out there for hours, phone banking, registering, and getting other Latinos out to vote. I remember one time in particular, after a long day of canvassing, I gave this undocumented woman from Oaxaca a ride home because she lived in my neighborhood of Boyle Heights. And during the ride home, we were debriefing about the day, and she said something about feeling so electorally empowered or powerful. All right, and when I asked her what she meant, she said that even if she didn't have papers or, was undocumented, she knew that day she had convinced at least 10 other Latinos who weren't going to vote to not only vote, but to vote the way she had convinced them to. So in reality, she said that she actually had more electoral power than the average American voter who only casts one ballot. And I never forgot that. And when during the Obama campaign, when I was out there door knocking with the Justice for Janitors Union in LA, again, it wasn't surprising to me to see a bunch of their undocumented members out there getting out to vote for Obama.
Though President Obama positioned himself as a supporter of immigrants and of Latino immigrants in particular, when you assess the totality of his record and his administrations, you're a professor, so what grade would you give him and why on his immigrant rights record?
I think his record is definitely mixed. Still trying to figure out the best ways to measure it. It depends, I think, ultimately on the specific area of immigration law or policies that you focus on, right? So a lawyer might be better suited to talk more specifically about the various administration policy changes that he made that didn't need Congress's approval, but that nonetheless helped make it easier for certain people to legalize. And obviously he did everything he could with DACA and DAPA, given the political context he was operating in. But I think his civil rights legacy will always be stained by the record number of deportations that the Republican-led Congress mandated and that his administration carried out during his presidency. At least during the first half of his time in the White House, Obama basically not only continued, but greatly increased the mass deportations that were started under the George W. Bush administration. On the positive note, I guess he did try several times to support federal comprehensive immigration reform that included a legalization program. But the truth is he never had the votes in Congress because Republicans controlled both the House and the Senate for most of his presidency. So any bill that even had the chance of seeing the light of day was always a pretty bad compromise bill. On the other hand, Republicans knew that they could never think of even passing another type of HR 4437 type of bill because Obama would have definitely vetoed it. So overall, if I were to compare him to other Republican and Democratic presidents, most of which have been pretty bad on immigration issues over the last 30 years, without the deportations, I'd give Obama maybe a B minus, probably only because of how much worse Trump is being. But considering the deportations, which we can never forget, I think his overall grade drops to no better than a D.
I think we can never forget the deporter-in-chief label is there for a reason.
Mm-hmm, definitely.
In the methods appendix of your book, you described how your graduate school training did not encourage or support self-reflexivity that feminist, queer, and ethnic studies scholars assert is critical to our research praxis. What would you tell a graduate student about who's in political science or who's in a government department like the one you were in today about the importance of having clarity regarding who they are in the research process and design?
I would say the same thing to political science and non-political science graduate students. When we start graduate school, I don't think we really realize how long our dissertation projects are going to be with us. I started mine in 2006, arguably before, and my book came out over 10 years later, and I'll probably be talking about it for another few years, depending on how well it does. So I think the worst thing a graduate student could do is choosing a topic because it's currently a hot issue or because they think it's what the job market desires. Because of this, I think it's fundamental that graduate students choose a research question or topic that they're passionate about, because they're going to be engaging with it for at least the next decade of their lives. So in terms of the research process and design, I think that they will and they should ultimately depend on their primary research questions. So figuring out a question or a problem that's either personal or politically important to them, ideally both, I think, is the most important step in the research process.
You were listening to Chris Zepeda Millan, Assistant Professor of Comparative Ethnic Studies at UC Berkeley. He is the author of Latino Mass Mobilization, Immigration, Racialization, and Activism, published by Cambridge University Press. As you write in the closing of your book, Chris, Republicans today are in firm control of the government since these 2006 immigrant right marches, and 45's Electoral College victory has meant that the country is being run by an unapologetic anti-immigrant leader. And your book talks about the ways in which legislation, right, led to these mobilizations. But now we're actually confronting an entire administration at every level. What do we need to take away from the need to organize now, the urgency of organizing now in preparation for the elections and beyond?
So, I think the way you framed it was perfect. We have to organize on all fronts. Registering and getting people out to vote is not an organic thing, and it doesn't run solely passion or hatred for a candidate. Organizations and foundations and communities have to invest in the creation and the growth of grassroots Latino groups. And then they have to also help fund naturalization, registration, and get out the vote drives, not only across the country, but especially in key presidential states like Florida and Arizona, where Latinos could make a political impact. Ultimately, politicians only care about staying in office. And the reason why the Republican Party has taken a sharp turn to the right is because conservative activists have taken all elections from local to national very seriously and little by little took over the Republican Party's agenda until Latinos and immigrants show both Democrats and Republicans that being anti-immigrant will lose them in an election. These parties aren't going to change on these issues.
Thank you so much for that food for thought, Chris. We really appreciate you being on the show today, Voces Criticas.
Thank you.